Hello everybody, it's jrobi. I wanted to do an endgame video today on a game that took place between Nigel Short and Rustam Kasimdzhanov at the Corus Chess Tournament 2009. And, Nigel Short's performance so far at Corus 2009 has been nothing short of spectacular. He's played a variety of openings and defenses, and it's always been fun to watch. I'm very, very much impressed by his play so far this year at Corus 2009. And I've been tracking and following the game since the tournament started on my blog, and I've actually got the live game viewer showing on my blog, so when the next round takes place, you can actually watch the games live right from my blog page. But let's get started here. So Nigel Short's playing white in this position, and he just played his king to f1. And I've drawn a big red X on the square e7, and the reason I put that there is because this is going to be a crucial square that Nigel uses to create a fairly nice position to work from. And he does so in very small incremental steps. So we're going to take a look at how this happens. I'm going to share what my thoughts are on the game, and of course I'm looking forward to your feedback as well. So let's get started. So from this position, Black brings the rook down to d3, and I've still got the e7 square highlighted because now Nigel's going to play a very nice move, which is bishop to e7, and this is forking both the rook and the knight. So Black has to do something about that. Obviously the rook needs to be saved in this position, but the rook doesn't have a lot of great options to go to. That's going to prevent Nigel from doubling up the black pawns. So from here, Black brings the rook down now to d5, and Nigel captures the knight on f6. So the pawn has to recapture, and now we've got doubled pawns. Black has doubled pawns to work with throughout the rest of the game. Now, doubled up pawns, it's always a little bit of a controversy in chess when you do some research on doubled up pawns. You'll find people that say that it's really important. If you have an opportunity to double the pawns, go ahead and do so. On the other hand, you'll have other people say, well, it's not that big of a deal. But in this particular position, Nigel shows that it helps to create a winning endgame. So from here, white plays the rook over to c2, and now Black snags up the pawn on f5. This lets white now come in and snag up the pawn on e4, and Black lands the check. Now, Nigel Short decided to block the check here, and Black has a decision. Does Black swap the rooks off the table at this point, or does Black retreat the rook? Black decided to bring the rook back to d3, and from here, Nigel lands the check, and when the king goes now to g7, Nigel brings the king up now to e2, attacking that rook on d3. The rook falls back now to d7, and Nigel brings the pawn up now to f3. Now this move not only is a force simply because we've got two attackers on the f2 square, but it's also got a nice side benefit of the fact that most of the pawns now are on light squares. In fact, the only pawn remaining on a dark square is the pawn on c3. So once again, another little small step towards building a strong endgame, because you'll note that Black's only remaining minor piece is a dark square bishop, and the majority of White's pieces are on light squares. So while that bishop's going to have some mobility and be able to move along these dark squares, it's not going to be able to directly attack any of those pieces, and that's something to really think about as we move closer towards the endgame. So from this position here, Black brings the bishop down now to g1, and Nigel plays rook over to d2, offering up a rook trade. Black brings its rook over now to d5, doubling up the rooks, but you'll notice that we have the knight here on c4 defending the rook on d2, so this isn't a huge concern for White at this point. Instead, what Nigel does is he plays the pawn up now to g4. Now this move on the surface doesn't look like it's really important, but it actually is, because by having the pawn now on g4 supported by two pawns on f3 and h3, it doesn't matter which pawn Black brings down, White is going to be able to defend and retake and maintain a pawn island as opposed to Black, and that's going to be important as we move forward. So from this position, Black comes down and takes the rook on d2, the knight recaptures, and now Black plays pawn to f5. So we have these doubled up pawns that were a little bit of a liability towards Black, and now Black's trying to get rid of that problem. So does Nigel capture here? Absolutely not, because if Nigel were to capture in this position, he would have doubled up pawns and an isolated pawn. So instead what Nigel does is he brings the rook now to e5. Now this move is attacking the pawns on a5 and f5, so Black plays pawn takes now on g4, and White can recapture. And now what I've done is I've put some squares around all the pawn islands on the board, except you'll notice one fundamental difference. The pawns on f7 and h6 are separated now, so they're isolated, whereas White now has two solid pawn islands to work with. So once again, White is building up those small advantages over the course of the game, helping to create an advantageous position once the endgame is reached. So from this position now, since black has an undefended pawn on a5, black plays a pawn now to b6 to defend that pawn, and white simply brings the knight now to a more active position on e4. Black swings the bishop over now, attacking the rook on e5, but Nigel just simply plays the rook over now to f5. So the rook is no longer in danger for the short term. From here now, black attacks the knight, not really attacking it per se because the knight does have a defender, but pinning that knight down, and Nigel plays now pawn to b4. So I think that what Nigel was trying to work towards here is to get his pawns off of those dark squares completely. You guys might have an idea about that, but that's what I see with the move to push the pawn up here. From here, black brings the rook down to trade the rooks, and Nigel actually accepts, captures with his rook, and then the bishop comes in, attacking the pawn on c3. But white doesn't have to worry about that because the knight is defending the pawn on c3, and the knight is on a light square, which means that knight is not going anywhere anytime soon. So from here now, white simply captures the pawn, black recaptures, and now Nigel brings the king up to a more centralized location on e3. From here now, black pushes the pawn now to c6, and white attacks the bishop, forcing the bishop back to c7, and from here now, Nigel brings the knight to g3, and we can see here that the knight has a lot of awesome squares to move to, and they're all light squares. Now, you might not know this about a knight, but a knight can actually reach every square on a chessboard. So if a knight starts off on a light square, the knight will land on a dark square. Alternatively, if the knight starts out on a dark square and moves, it'll land up on a light square. So by placing the knight on g3, all of Nigel's options for the knight here are light squares, meaning that that bishop isn't going to be a problem. So from here now, black brings the king down to g6, and Nigel brings his king even closer to the center of the board to e4. And this is really important because the white king is going to want to stop the black king from infiltrating its position. So getting closer to the center of the board is going to give more options for the white king. And it's also worth mentioning that white now has the power of opposition because the rule of diagonal opposition states that whoever is to move with an odd number of squares in between the kings does not have opposition. So black does not have the power of opposition in this position. So that means that white can basically stop the black king from encroaching too far into its position. So from here now, black plays a bishop over to d6, and white brings the knight up now to f5, attacking the bishop. So the bishop comes back now to c5. Now this bishop is starting to look a little bit silly because the pieces that it can attack, the dark square pawns, it would have to do several moves to line up an attack on those pieces, and white is going to be able to counter. So the bishop isn't really accomplishing much here in the endgame. As opposed to that, though, the knight is looking very beautiful here, and it's going to get even more powerful as the game progresses. So from here now, white comes into h4 and hits a check, and when the king falls back to g7, the white knight comes to f3, and as you can see, it's getting closer and closer to being able to attack the pieces on this side of the board. So from here, black plays a pawn now to f6, taking away the e5 square from the knight, but the knight has much larger intentions than e5. Instead, white now plays the knight to d2, and as you can see here, the knight now has access to b3, which is going to be a problem for black because it's going to put constant pressure on a5 and c5. The knight also has the option, however, to access c4 depending on how play follows. But after black plays bishop to b6, Nigel plays a very good move here and brings the king up to f5. And just take a look at this position now. We have numerous threats building up on black. The king now is attacking the pawn on f6, and very shortly the knight is going to be putting that tremendous amount of pressure on a5 and c5. So black's options are running out. Like it's almost like the position is getting strangled. So after that, black plays the king now to f7, and now comes this knight into the very powerful square of b3. And this knight and king are providing a tremendous amount of pressure now on black's position because a number of pieces are being attacked. We have the pawn on a5 that's being attacked, and we also have the pawn on f6 that's being attacked. And there's really not a good way that black can defend those. Like it almost seems tempting to bring the bishop here to d8, but that turns out that doesn't work out very well at all because what happens after that, let's just take a look at that quickly. If we go bishop to d8, white has the following moves: knight to d4, pawn has to be pushed, otherwise it falls, at which point the knight comes back attacking the pawn again, and from here now, black can defend both pawns, but now the knight can quickly swing back into the action, and after here it's pretty much all over for black because the pieces just start to come off the board very quickly. But if we go back to b3, that's not the only threat that's in the position. We have the pawn on the c file that can be pushed up freely at will in this position. because if the black pawn were to be pushed down, that would allow the white king now to come in and support the knight for a capture. Furthermore, once this pawn gets to c5, the bishop has to retreat along this diagonal to maintain the defense of the pawn on a5, at which point the knight has now d4 attacking the light square pawn. And the black king can't give up the control of the square of g6, because then all of a sudden the pawn on h6 will fall. So it's a tremendously awesome position that Nigel was able to build up in his game against his fellow Grandmaster. And shortly thereafter, after black moved the king to g7 and white pushed the pawn to c4, black resigned. So I definitely enjoyed going over this endgame, and looking forward to your feedback and what you think about the position and how Nigel played. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.